filming this on a Tuesday, which means my neighbor is mowing their yard at the slowest pace possible. And Josh ffxiv asks the question, are MMOs growing again?
Few months, the MMORPG genre has experienced somewhat of a renaissance. The status quo has been shaken up and the dominance of the old guard is being challenged. New studios are bringing out new games, new players are flooding in and discovering the joys of the MMO, while old players are questioning long-held beliefs about game design. Is the MMO about to have a rebirth within the gaming landscape?
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm Josh ffxiv. The MMORPG is a fantastic genre with millions of players around the world. Players enjoy the mechanics of the MMO, creating a character, leveling, dungeons, raiding, leveling up your skills, and having your own adventure online. And yet many people have been saying, since around 2016, the genre has been going downhill. Is that about to change? Was it true at all? Let's have a look at the state of the genre as it is right now, and see if we're going through somewhat of an MMO renaissance.
Before we begin, if you want to support the channel for free, you can like the video or sub for more MMO stuff, ring the bell for all the future notifications, and a special thank you to all those who support via Patreon or Twitch. More on how you can do this at the end. For now,
if you'd like to support him, I encourage you to go over and watch him on Twitch. He does all these crazy voices, and it makes for a very engaging stream, even if he's playing a game that you don't recognize. RuneScape, for example, I know many people may not recognize. Many people who were later into the space may not understand exactly what's going on, and I encourage you to catch his streams.
Now, let's begin. Back in February 2021, MMORPG YouTuber The Lazy Peon put out the excellent video The Absolute State of the MMORPG Genre. In the video, he laments the financial support that's been shown to other genres such as battle royales and first-person shooters, while the MMO has sadly been left behind. But why is this? Well,
Lazy Peon also goes on to look for a very specific set of things by which he defines a MMO to be worth playing. And so I will say that, like, right from the get-go, if you're looking at Lazy Peon's point of view, there's a ton of thought there and a ton of effort, and he makes very well-produced videos. But what he looks for in MMO is very, very, very specific, and it kind of highlights within a genre that's already very niche compared to all of gaming as a definition, how we get this way. Because him versus me, we look for very, very different things. And when we're looking for very different things, you can see how as we fracture a community, I'm not offering the financial support to the games that he likes, and he's not offering them to the ones I like in many, many cases.
Well, back in 1997, the world was introduced to Ultima Online. Then 2 years later, in 1999, EverQuest arrived, and thus began one of the greatest gaming rivalries. The MMORPG had two franchise titans, and EverQuest and Ultima actually remained surprisingly close to each other in popularity for many years. Then along came Acheron's Call to challenge them both, and while never taking the crown, it did extremely well. Then more games arrived, and the MMORPG genre had a healthy, real-world gaming meta. No one game dominated, no one style was vastly superior. The game selection was smaller than today, but the player base was stable between all of them. Then came the MMORPG boom. World of Warcraft, RuneScape, Guild Wars, Anarchy Online, Ragnarok Online, Final Fantasy XI, EVE, Toontown Online, Lineage 2, Second Life, City of Heroes. The MMORPG gold rush had begun.
Companies knew there was money to be made in the MMORPG landscape, but as of yet, the specific design structure wasn't known. Fantasy or sci-fi? Action combat or tab target combat? Player versus player or player versus environment? The meta of the MMORPG design hadn't yet been solved, and this meant there was lovely creative chaos. When there is no structure for how to design something for the biggest financial gain, then creative people just throw multiple ideas out and see what works.
It was a great time to see the creativity within combat systems. When you could play something like Baldur's Gate on the same day you played Nox, and then you could hop into World of Warcraft and make progression and then go try to get loot in Diablo, like, it was a great time to be a gamer. And that is not to say those games would hold up compared to the level of game design and graphic fidelity and, thoughtfulness that can go into a game now. But for what it was, for what was available, for what was known, it was an incredible time to be an MMORPG player, looking to get that kind of feel out of games, whether they were just LAN at the time or they were truly massively multiplayer, because what was capable at the time, those didn't feel that different in some cases. Me playing with my brother across the house could feel a lot like playing, with somebody across the world in many cases for the technology at the time. Now our expectations are rightfully much, much higher now that we can have incredible hardware available for a very low dollar amount. As we start to talk about cloud gaming moving forward, MMOs are poised to take advantage of each stage of technology. And cloud gaming, in my opinion, would really allow this to, on top of the current push into MMOs, would allow MMOs to move even further, where you start to say, okay, now you don't have to have min spec, max spec. You already have a player population with disposable income and good internet connection as a basis. And so unlike other games where the concern of cloud is like, well, I don't have access to good internet, you have to start to wonder, would MMORPGs be in a better position than most genres to be cloud-based for at least some portion of what they do?
You have to take the risk when there's no blueprint to copy. And it's this risk that leads to fantastic, interesting, creative situations. We don't know what we're going to get. Something might work. It's the same as when an MMORPG releases a new patch or a new dungeon or a new update. Players don't know what works. We don't know what the best item to use is. We don't know what the best setup is. And it's this lovely chaos, this beauty of the unknown that allows us to be so creative. It's taking the risks that gives us the creative rewards.
Yeah, I do think that. I think that a lot of that has gone by the wayside where players have not enjoyed it, as we've seen things like the WoW PTR system, the Guild Wars 2 live beta system, the Final Fantasy it is what it was last time system, where they're going to release a new item set in the same way they released the last one. So, and they're going to show us what it looks like and what it's called. So we're going to get the new tombstone. We're going to go to the vendor. We're going to buy it. Some of what he's describing has actually gone away because clearly we as players don't actually want what we think we want, or at least that's what the devs believe. I don't know how they come up with, somebody saying you think you do but you don't can feel very, very, very dismissive. But what if they're right? Like, what if they really do know better? And so some of what he's describing, I think there was more mystery back then, as opposed to now I play a game I've never played before, and I immediately am grasping underlying systems because they tend to be very iterative based on other games and what's been done before. So I'm not sure at this point that we're getting that same innovation across the board. I think usually each game is picking one or two or three areas to really innovate. And then, of course, that's rippling in how everything else feels as like a tone. But I don't know that it's a stark shakeup of every single system in games anymore. And the early years that he's describing, it was. The early years, they could just toss things out. And the number of players in a party, the way a dungeon worked, like there weren't rules, and some of that resulted in very bad gameplay. But every once in a while, it worked. It created something that is the pattern we did today, and along the way, it was really fun to be involved in that mystery.
Everyone had been thrown into chaos. Companies didn't know what to design, and the meta of the MMO design hadn't yet been solved. This gave us so many different games.
Yeah, it is a stark contrast. So what he's describing is as it was, and it's a stark contrast with where we are today.
The early to mid era of the MMORPG was similar to the early to mid era of the mobile phone. Companies were throwing some crazy designs at the wall and seeing what worked, what the public would actually respond well to. If you were a kid in the late 90s, mid 2000s like I was, you'll probably remember everyone having a different mobile phone with a different operating system and a different charging cable. It was a wild time for design. And these crazy wild situations are absolute breeding grounds for creativity. When no one knows what will work, or when you've got multiple styles all working equally well, people are driven to find unique solutions, ideas, and styles. It's a designer's paradise when the correct choice, financially, isn't known. And then the risks they take start to pay off. But one paid off more than the others. World of Warcraft. Slowly, one MMO emerged as the king and began to make all the money. Now, from a design standpoint, the emergence of a single dominating system means one thing. The clones are coming. When the audience is young and the design space is fresh, risk is the best business strategy because the chance of success is equal roughly everywhere. But when the audience is known, risk becomes a terrible tactic. If you want to make guaranteed money, you'll just copy what works. With Warcraft dominating and EverQuest creeping ahead of Ultima, the standard was being set. If you were a company making an MMO, you likely wanted a third-person fantasy game with classes, tab-target combat, and grindy gameplay with endgame dungeons and raids as your focus. It was proven to work. The formula had been found.
One of the worst things that can happen to a creative space is the design within it becoming solved. Once you know the best set of steps to take to achieve a certain goal, you'd be a fool not to take them. In Warhammer 40k, if a certain army becomes all-powerful and all-dominant, you'd be an idiot not to play the army. In Magic the Gathering, if one deck became unbeatable, you'd want to play the deck. In any MMORPG, once the meta is known how to play your class, you play your class in that way. It takes away the freedom and the creativity, and designing a game is no different. Once companies knew how to build an MMORPG for the maximum return on investment, everyone did that. If your goal is victory or profit,
I think the problem is that that's not the only thing players have to choose from. We live in a time, and have lived in a time since this point, where there have been a huge number of MMOs to choose from. And as a result, that's not your only choice. In Warhammer 40k, if you do not have the winningest army, you don't just go out and buy the winningest army. First of all, your shop probably doesn't have it in stock. The online orders take forever to fill. And second of all, it's not cheap. It can be hundreds and hundreds of dollars to fill out missing models in an army, much less building an all-new one with a new codex, all new rules. Then you have to build that. If your local meta requires paint, you have to do all that, and it is easier to just not play. That is true in the video game world as well. If you don't like the way a certain class plays, or if the act of leveling and gearing that class is really time expensive, then you just won't do it. You'll just not play it. And so if there is not a counter or a reasonable chance at success by your definition available within your class or your army or whatever, the alternative is frustration. And so what can happen is you see that initial growth from people that are willing to make that conversion, and you lean into it and you see more growth, and you lean into it and you see more growth, right up until it's not, right up until your meta breaks. And then out of nowhere, you see this frustration where you will have a mass exodus of players, at least for a short time, until you fix your balance.
you'd be a fool not to follow the meta. This kills design. I'm not blaming World of Warcraft specifically for homogenizing the genre. If it hadn't been that one, another game would have. It just happened to be the game that found the specific combination of franchise recognition and design style that appealed to a lot of people. And now designers knew that taking risks wasn't worth it. Risking success in a chaotic landscape with everyone else also risking is potentially lucrative. Risking when you've already got a guaranteed method of success is not appealing to most companies. Over the next few years, we did indeed get some new MMOs, but most came and then went. Wildstar, The Secret World, The Matrix Online, Shadowbane, Asheron's Call 2, Star Wars Galaxies, The Lord of the Rings Online. Some of these games found minor levels of success, most of them shut down. The MMORPG was an extremely expensive genre to make, and since the majority of the player base was focused on a single game, it had a relatively low chance of giving a decent return on investment. You were unlikely to steal another game's players. The major MMORPGs that did manage to rise in power were all offering something that Warcraft didn't. RuneScape didn't require a download, Guild Wars 2 was a buy once play forever game, or they were supported by huge franchises. The Elder Scrolls Online had Skyrim, Final Fantasy XIV had Final Fantasy, and the genre settled into this stable position for a while. The 5 major MMORPGs were...
So when you say that a game offers something unique, that's really, you only need the one or two things. You don't have to be totally unique in every single way. It's been very frustrating over recent years to feel like I've seen the first-person shooter market trying to re-innovate on matchmaking, on literal the party finding system. When I go to join my friends, I press join and it joins. And now they've got these weird systems where getting in a party with my friends is different, and I don't see how it improves anything. I do see ways in that it's kicking people out. It seems to make the party system less stable. We're losing people between rounds. And this is something that was working fairly straightforward for the last 10 or 15 years. And so sometimes innovation for innovation's sake doesn't feel good. Trying to make it work like some weird version of Facebook or Twitter doesn't actually help me. It worked fine. Just leave it how it was and then innovate in areas that we actually see improvement. And we see that with Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy has took a huge amount of inspiration from the existing MMOs, namely World of Warcraft, as they rebuilt 1.0 into 2.0, and that is still seen in foundational levels of brand new content still being implemented to this day. There is a huge number of systems within Final Fantasy that look a lot like World of Warcraft, and World of Warcraft Shadowlands has many systems that look like a crossover between previous versions of those systems and what Final Fantasy is doing. Inspiration on its own does not mean there is not innovation present. It's what makes defining intellectual property and fair use so difficult, is how much copying is too much copying. You shouldn't have to be born in a cave and totally design in a vacuum to be allowed to own your idea. On the other hand, changing one thing where we can still see 99% of the original thing isn't really innovation. So I do think that some of these games have taken something. He mentions that Guild Wars was buy to play, but Guild Wars also shifted the paradigm on PvP versus PvE focus. They also shifted the way we think about leveling. When you move into Guild Wars 2, leveling is even crazier because Guild Wars 2 has been max level since its launch. We've stayed the same max level, which is where World of Warcraft is ending up now. Guild Wars 1, you could borrow skills from other classes. Final Fantasy had the cross-class system, which is based around the subclass system, kind of, that we've seen across other Final Fantasy games in the past. These minor little changes, they're not that big, but they change the entire texture about how we interact with the game. So even if the UI looks the same, or the party system is the same, or the format of a dungeon with the number of players and it's trash boss, resulting in loot that raises an item level in the following D&D style set of slots, following the same sets of stats, those all feel very different if you change the context.
World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV, The Elder Scrolls Online, Guild Wars 2 and RuneScape were the titans of the genre, with several smaller but still successful games floating around the edge. Star Wars The Old Republic, Neverwinter, Dungeons & Dragons Online, Lord of the Rings Online, Terra and others sitting off to the sidelines. The gold rush, at least in the MMORPG design space, was finished, and plucky young designers moved on to different, less risky genres. If you're a game development company, at this point in time, you don't want to make an MMORPG. They're incredibly expensive, have a really long development time, and a very, very low chance of actually making any profit.
We are seeing games starting to make MMOs again. Like, there's rumors that, like, Riot's starting one. There's a number of them out there. So I wouldn't say they're not willing to. I think that when you compare it, though, to do you have something in the mobile space and are you dominating in your space, I would agree with him. But it's not that you don't want to at all. It's that it's not your first priority. And so for companies that have the bandwidth to take on multiple priorities, it is on the list.
Back when the gold rush was happening and people didn't know what would make money, it was worth it. But the research had been done, the R&D was finished, and people had discovered that a successful MMORPG took a hell of a lot of money to make. That gold rush was now happening in other games, battle royales. The mobile gaming market was making absolute strides and billions of dollars. The MMORPG genre had been solved design-wise, and that gold rush was over. Right up until it started again.
By gold rush, I mean the moment companies realise there's an excessive amount of money to be made, and over the last 6 months in the MMO world, we've seen some major movements from big companies, and some interesting additions from smaller ones. If a game is solved, there's no point making any different moves, like tic-tac-toe. Once the winning combination is known, just copy it. And this is true right up until the winning combination stops winning. World of Warcraft is falling. Final Fantasy XIV is raising. And this switch in power is a symptom of a major new era in the MMO world. Not every single MMO player wants to play a single game forever. They want to play them until they stop having fun and then move on to another one. Variety becomes the spice of life. Players want new experiences, and for the last few years this has meant players have cycled between the top 5 MMOs, occasionally trying the smaller ones, but now we seem to be reaching a player boredom boiling point. Every MMO player has tried all the top games, most of them have tried the smaller games, and the companies are realizing the player base wants something new and are actually serious about playing a new game. Amazon are moving in with New World to capture the casual PvP crowd. Mortal Online 2 wants the hardcore PvP players. RuneScape Mobile wants the mobile market. Ashes of Creation is aiming to recreate that classic RPG feel. Bless Online has just released. League of Legends is making an MMO. Star Citizen is probably releasing another pre-release ship to make more money. It may one day exist, it may not, who knows.
The early days of the MMORPG boom were brought about because companies realised this new genre, the MMO, had an untapped player base and there was a lot of money to be made. Companies took risks, several companies failed, a few succeeded, and the early days were won by EverQuest, Ultima Online, Asheron's Call, World of Warcraft, RuneScape, Guild Wars. These games rose to the surface, some of them kept going for years and years after. The risk was just too big to take now. If you're a new company, making an MMO would likely bankrupt you. So the MMO sat back. Games companies enjoyed making vast amounts of profits, and players slowly became bored. The genre stagnated because it was too risky for any new company to enter. And this, ironically, made it worth entering. Because players wanted a new game. They hadn't had a new good game, in a hell of a long time. And suddenly, the money was there to be made again. The player base were crying out for a new game, and the risk suddenly became worth the reward.
There's also a lot more money now. So it's not just that the big ones fell. It's that, gaming is now being compared, even though it's massively outshined by industries like cosmetics. It's still behind, but the fact that it's mentioned in the same articles as these luxury goods that people are spending a ton of money on globally, you have venture capitalists that are looking to put their money somewhere that it can perform in an unexpected way. And so when you see people continuing to try to make a profit at esports, they're just hoping, because the first person to do it, the first person to make massive, wide-scale, sustainable, high percentage gains on it, compared to the handful of teams that have been able to make money at all, they're going to be loaded, right? And so they want that kind of, I was an early investor in something like Twitter type moment. I was an early investor in something like World of Warcraft type moment. They want to be part of something that becomes genre defining, or at least kind of generational genre defining. And so you have a lot of money entering gaming now. So I don't think it's just that World of Warcraft fell off. I think you also have a lot of people saying, hey, it fell off, I think I can do this. And you have other people saying, I'd be happy to pay for that.
A healthy, unsolved meta is vital to the long-term success of anything competitive or creative. EverQuest and Ultima were so close for so many years, and this meant they both focused on being the best versions of themselves because something about them was appealing. They didn't need to follow a known formula and become gentrified. Competition leads to innovation, invention, and creation. Once Warcraft began to dominate, design became do what works and copy that, not do what we're good at or create something new. Now, with Warcraft failing, suddenly the top 5 MMOs are actually leveling out again, and this is forcing them to all focus on what they are specifically good at, not just copying a known formula, because the formula isn't working as well as it used to. We have returned to the point where risk is worth it. Renaissance means rebirth, revitalization, or a renewed interest in something. It can be a slow burn change or a dramatic shift. In most cases, it's a combination of both. In the MMORPG genre, it's the slow creeping boredom caused by multiple years of industry dominance and solved gameplay design causing the player base to wish for something new, combined with a sudden shift in the player base away from Warcraft and toward other games such as Final Fantasy, which is...
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of repetition within any one game, and the question is, what innovation can you have without losing what made you unique in the first place? Final Fantasy has a ton of repetition in it. We know exactly what is going to be in the bulk of each patch, literally for an entire expansion cycle, because it's been on repeat. And we know the amount of narrative that we're going to get, and then we know that it will be this amount or more. It's very narrative based. Some of the narrative is something that, once you get a feel for the tone, seems to be reasonably predictable. And like across the board, it's not on its own that wild of an experience. Now, the quality that it delivers all that at, the percentage of effort that it puts towards particular systems, and the success with which the devs are able to communicate with a community of this size make it fairly unique in the space. But if you stay in it long enough, there is a fair bit of repetition there. That repetition, for many, at least for me, is a sense of comfort. It's a sense of known. I know what it's going to be, and I feel very at home here. But at some point, that can shift to I want something new. And while Final Fantasy so far has continued to offer that through the remaining percentage of each patch that is that unknown, the changes in systems such as Relic, the addition of new systems, anytime we've seen something added, like when we first added Deep Dungeon or we first added Blue Mage, where we don't know what these things are, as we look forward to adding Island Sanctuary and so on, that's what adds that spice. But at some point that may not be enough. World of Warcraft adds a new system and reiterates on old ones every single expansion, and that sounds a lot like what I just described with Final Fantasy. They try to communicate with their community. I don't think they do nearly as good of a job. And so in many ways, the same set of features I list, there might be a fan of World of Warcraft that says they have all the same things. And they do, right until they don't.
Just made companies realize the genre is being shaken up. The gold rush is here again. The risks are worth it. World of Warcraft solved MMO design for many years. As far as player counts go, clones were made to emulate the success, and a lucky few managed to survive. The genre became too much of a risk to enter. Battle Royale games made more money for less risk. Mobile gaming was far more profitable. But now the player base is bored, the power has shifted, and the companies have realised while mobile gaming is still the best choice financially, the MMORPG genre isn't completely done. It's not as solved as they thought. Companies, once again, are taking risks. I have long believed the last year has been the start of a new golden age for the MMORPG, but what do you think? Are we seeing the start of a renaissance, or will these new games fade into obscurity like so many before them, and will we sit back into the boring status quo? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you.
I think that there is something interesting about the idea of trying to catch the start of a renaissance, the start of a change in gaming. Defining generations, defining these eras is something that's very easily done by the history books. They can look back and see what events acted as the final catalyst and what events acted as the official end, and then they can define that period. It's very hard to know in the moment, in the present, if something is changing. Are there things changing in the MMOs? Yes, but they've been changing for the last 15 years. There have been changes. Is this going to be the set of changes that results in something new and different? I don't know, because Final Fantasy in many ways is so similar to World of Warcraft that if all this is a handing off of the baton between World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy, and World of Warcraft has to play second for a little while Final Fantasy sits in the top slot, that's not really a industry-wide system change. As a Final Fantasy fan, I of course am thrilled. But if you are looking for an industry-defining change that takes us back to the early years, or it's the Wild West time of innovation, I don't know that we're really in danger of that at this time, because there is a ton of formulaic aspects of Final Fantasy that it's in the top slot and will likely continue to remain there for many years to come. We aren't expecting anything wildly different out of the Raid, Trial, Alliance Raid systems. We aren't expecting anything wildly different out of its dungeon system. Therefore, the loot system across the board will remain largely intact for all of next expansion. We know that the two new classes are largely going to slide in very logically in with the existing classes, so the battle system as a whole will iteratively move forward. We'll not see any core foundational differences that make it feel unplayable by somebody who only likes to play the current way, and vice versa. It will be iterative. It will not be this large sweeping innovation where it is a massive risk taken. It just won't be. We're not going to see a massive shift in the way quests are done and the fact that you level up 10 times doing quests to hit max level and that we switch to alts. Across the board, Final Fantasy Endwalker is going to be an expansion on Shadowbringers, not a new game. For most of us, that's good news. But in this video, he's talking about innovation in a way where we can risk failure, where we can risk something being dreadfully awful, where any one company might lose their lunch on a bad gamble, but the industry as a whole can see what works and what doesn't and move forward. I'm not sure that right now is that time, but I do think we are building towards that time. And so if in hindsight we look back and realize this was the moment that World of Warcraft handing off the baton to Final Fantasy was the ultimate catalyst, then maybe it is. But maybe it's what happens when something like Starlink kicks on and you have a massive surge in the number of people who are interested in games like this because the number of people with access increases. Maybe it's cloud-based hardware so that people who say that they can't afford a console or a gaming PC, when that expands, I think a lot of what Fortnite's success has been based around is that they only needed people to have phones. They didn't have to have access to traditional gaming platforms to be a part of that movement. And so it could be a shift in access. It could be a shift in the pay model. We've seen a lot of continued efforts around the pay model, in which case we'd probably back the start of this era up to kind of the catalyst events surrounding things like the lawsuits in the EU and so on, as we start to look at what are microtransactions, how are those defined, when is the end of the subscription-based era, the buy-to-play era, and the move into this free-to-play where you are purchasing access to seasonal-based content, or you're purchasing access to microtransactions to make a bunch of pennies add up to a very large amount of money that supports the creator, and you're only responsible for the number of pennies that you choose to be involved in. And then the question becomes, how do we define that choice as we go down and we start to say what's gambling and what's not, what's predatory and what's not, and all these definitions. So if it becomes a monetization question, I think that we likely already have started to see the beginning fractures of the system as it sits today, as we look towards a future way of funding games of this scale. And so I think it is a question of what is this Renaissance going to build for us? Depending on how you studied the Renaissance, if you studied it through art, if you studied it through architecture, if you studied it through politics, all of those were being affected, and they were being affected at slightly different times, in slightly different ways, because sometimes one acted as the catalyst for another. And some of, architecture might have been affected by aesthetics, but it also might have been affected by building technologies. And so it's not as simple as, in my opinion, as World of Warcraft fell, and so now everybody feels they can take risks. World of Warcraft fell, and some people are going to wonder if they can make a World of Warcraft clone with just enough different that they can have success. Because from an evidence-based standpoint, from the outside looking in, that's what Final Fantasy did, and they're poised to make a killing. And so I don't know that this on its own encourages the wide-scale innovation that we as players, who aren't going to be the ones who lose our businesses if they guess wrong, would love to see, just because it means there's a ton of innovation. We'll have to see what things like New World do and all these other MMOs coming online, as we are just days out from New World coming online. Do people with big pockets take risks? And if they do, are they rewarded? Typically, gamers define innovation as something that is both new and different, and that they enjoy. When they don't enjoy something, they see it as a failure. And so oftentimes a game is considered stale when it is keeping all the things they like the same, and all the things that they don't like are the only areas where they're innovating. And so you need to not only innovate to satisfy gamers, but you need to innovate and be successful at it. We can't just document things that don't work. We need to find things that do work. And by that definition, I am not yet sure that we're going to see a massive shift in gaming very shortly, but I would love to be wrong, and I think it is something best determined looking backward, kinda.